My daughter's boyfriend called me the help at her medical school graduation dinner, right to my face, in front of 40 people who had no idea who I really was. I didn't correct him. I just smiled, refilled his water glass since he seemed to think that was my job, and made a mental note of everything. Here's what Nathan Caldwell didn't know about the quiet man in the slightly worn blazer sitting at the far end of the table. I'd spent 31 years building a software infrastructure company out of a spare bedroom in Dayton, Ohio. Sold it to a private equity group in 2021 for $41 million. My name is on 3 patents for data security protocols still used by half the major hospital networks in this country, including, as it turned out, the one where my daughter had just matched for her residency. But that night, I was just Audrey's dad, the one who drove a 7-year-old Ford F-150 and wore a Costco blazer to her graduation dinner. Nathan never bothered to learn anything else. Let me back up to where this really started, because the graduation dinner wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment I decided enough was enough. Audrey had been dating Nathan for about 14 months when she graduated from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. She called me from Baltimore every Sunday, and I could hear the change in her voice over those months. Quieter, more careful with her words. She stopped talking about her research the way she used to. The excited rambling about immunology that I could follow, maybe 30% of, but loved listening to anyway. Nathan Caldwell was the son of a Connecticut family that had been wealthy for 3 generations. His grandfather had built something real. His father had maintained it. Nathan mostly talked about it at dinner parties. He worked in wealth management, which from what I could observe meant he managed other people's wealth while spending a considerable amount of his own family's. I met him for the first time at Thanksgiving, about 8 months before graduation. He flew first class to Baltimore, where Audrey had rented a place, and I drove up from Dayton. 11 hours. I brought a pecan pie from the bakery Audrey had loved since she was 7, the one on 5th Street that still uses her grandmother's recipe. Nathan looked at the pie box like I'd brought a live raccoon to the table. Audrey mentioned your background, he said over the turkey, and the way he said it made background sound like a polite word for something else. Self-made, right? Started from nothing? Started from a spare bedroom, I said. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they've already decided the answer before they ask the question. Audrey's going to be a physician. That's a different world. Connections matter in medicine. Who you know, where you trained, what family name you carry in. He looked at me pleasantly. It must be reassuring for you to know she'll have that kind of support through my family. I watched Audrey's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She'd heard this speech before. Very reassuring, I said. Over the months that followed, I paid attention. I'm a data person by nature. I don't make decisions on gut feelings alone. I observe patterns. The pattern with Nathan was consistent. At Audrey's match day celebration, when she found out she'd matched at UCSF for her residency, he spent most of the evening talking to the program directors about his family's foundation, angling for some connection that would benefit him. When Audrey cried happy tears opening her envelope, he was across the room networking. When she calls me one Sunday and mentioned she'd been struggling with a particular research presentation, Nathan's solution had been to suggest she let someone more polished handle the slides. She had published 2 papers in peer-reviewed journals by that point. She didn't need someone more polished. She needed someone to believe in her. When she mentioned once, carefully, that she sometimes worried about finances during residency, Nathan had said she told me this quietly, like she was embarrassed to repeat it. Don't worry, my family will make sure you're comfortable. You just focus on your little career. Her little career. She had sacrificed 12 years of her life for that little career. Undergrad on scholarship. MCAT studying at my kitchen table while I made coffee at 5 a.m. so she'd have it waiting. Medical school loans that terrified both of us until I quietly set up a trust to cover them. She didn't know about the trust. I'd done it through my attorney with instructions not to reveal the source unless necessary. I never told her about the money, about any of it, When my wife, her mother, passed from ovarian cancer 6 years ago, I thought often about what Carol would have wanted me to do was what we'd built. Carol grew up with very little. She used to say that money was just the answer to a question. The question was, what kind of person you were. I wanted to know what kind of person Nathan Caldwell was. So I started asking questions. 3 months before graduation, I called my old business partner, a man named Gil, who still ran circles in the software and investment world and knew everyone worth knowing. I need to run a background on someone, I said. Thorough. What Gil found wasn't criminal, it was just revealing. Nathan's wealth management role was essentially a courtesy title at a firm his uncle owned. His personal finances were, to put it charitably, aspirational. 2 car leases he could barely cover. A condo in Greenwich with a mortgage his salary alone couldn't service. He was, for lack of a gentler term, maintaining appearances. And he was very interested in Audrey's future earning potential as a physician. I sat with that information for a long time, then I started making my own arrangements. I didn't do the wheelchair. I didn't do the oxygen tank. I want to be clear about what I did and why. I just stopped correcting assumptions. I'd been doing it passively for months anyway, and Nathan had been filling in the blanks just fine on his own. I drove my old truck. I kept wearing my regular clothes. When Nathan asked at one point what I was, up to these days work-wise, I mentioned I did some consulting, which was true, and let the word sit there small and unimpressive the way he seemed to want it to. I watched what he did with that. What he did was talk to Audrey more than once about estate planning for my eventual passing, about whether I had things organized, about whether she should expect to be responsible for my care down the line. He was calculating an inheritance and finding it disappointing. The graduation dinner was at a restaurant in San Francisco called Acquarello, Italian. The kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices on the guest copies. Nathan had made the reservation. His parents flew in from Greenwich. His mother, Vivian, wore jewelry that cost more than my first car and smiled at me with practiced warmth. His father, George, shook my hand once and then spent the rest of the pre-dinner hour talking to the residency program director, who'd also been invited. There were about 40 people at that dinner, Audrey's fellow graduates and their families, attending physicians. Program leadership. I sat at the end of the table, not by accident. I'd arrived early. I'd seen the seating arrangement. Nathan had apparently coordinated with the restaurant. I was placed at the far end, between 2 people I didn't know, away from Audrey, away from the program director, away from anyone whose opinion Nathan considered worth managing. I found my seat and sat down without complaint. The moment that changed everything happened during appetizers. A server came to refill waters and accidentally skipped me. Nathan, seated near the center of the table, glanced down toward my end and said to the young woman beside him, loud enough to carry, "Oh, could someone get the water to the end?" Though, honestly, from the way he came in, I thought he was the help. He laughed. The young woman laughed uncertainly. 2 or 3 people close to him laughed. Audrey, 3 seats away, went completely still. She looked at me. I picked up my bread plate, inspected it mildly, set it back down. I smiled at her. "It's all right, not yet." She didn't look convinced, but she knew me well enough to see something in my face that made her wait. The dinner went on. Nathan gave a little toast that was primarily about the Caldwell Family Foundation and their commitment to medical excellence, and secondarily about Audrey. The program director, Dr. Crobran, Patricia Ose, gave a genuine and warm toast that was entirely about Audrey and made her cry, which made me have to press my thumb into my palm to hold it together. When Nathan's father, George, finally spoke to me, about halfway through the main course, it was to ask if I'd gotten out to California much, like I was a tourist. "When I need to," I said. "Audrey tells us you're in Ohio, Dayton area." He said Dayton the way people say the name of a town they've never considered visiting. "Born and raised. Good people out there," he said. The tone was the same one people use to compliment a child's drawing. He turned back to the program director. I sat with it. I let it accumulate. After dinner and during dessert, Nathan stood again and said he wanted to share some exciting news. He and Audrey had been discussing their future, he said, and in light of her upcoming residency, his family was prepared to offer what he called meaningful support to help them build the kind of life appropriate for a physician of Audrey's caliber. His mother smiled. His father nodded. Several guests murmured appreciatively. Audrey looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Part apology, part exhaustion. That's when I stood up. "I'd like to say something too," I said. The table quieted. Nathan looked mildly surprised, the way you look when the background scenery starts moving. "My name is Robert Mays," I said. "I'm Audrey's father. 42 years ago, I grew up 20 minutes from the GM plant in Dayton, where my own father worked second shift. I put myself through Ohio State on a combination of Pell Grants, campus jobs, and stubbornness. I slept 4 hours a night for about 6 years, building a company in a room that also had a washer-dryer in it." The table was very quiet. "I sold that company in 2021, I continued. "For $41 million. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't perform it. I just said the number the way you'd say any true thing. Tonight I heard someone refer to me as the help." I looked at Nathan. His face had gone a specific shade I can only describe as the color of a man recalculating rapidly. "I've been called worse. What I haven't been in my 63 years is someone who lets cruelty at a dinner table go unaddressed. Not when the person being made to feel small is sitting at the end of the table my daughter invited me to." Dr. Osei had put down her fork. "I've watched for 14 months, I said. "I wanted to know who my daughter was building a future with. The kind of thing you can't learn from a conversation. You learn it from how a person behaves when they think the person next to them doesn't matter." I pulled out my phone. I use a simple Samsung. Nathan had once, within my earshot, described it to a friend as the phone his daughter's dad had. "A week ago," I said, "I finalized a trust fund for Audrey. It contains $12 million, structured to give her full access upon the completion of her residency, with one condition." I looked at Audrey. Her hand was over her mouth. "The condition is that it's hers, in her name. For her, not a household, not a partnership, not a family foundation with someone else's name on the wall. Audrey's. To do with as she sees fit, whenever she sees fit. Her little career built it. Her little career." I watched Nathan understand that I'd heard that. "The remaining funds," I said, "are already distributed. I made transfers this week to the Johns Hopkins Financial Aid Endowment, specifically for first-generation medical students. Another portion went to a non-profit in Dayton that provides STEM education to kids in the neighborhoods where I grew up, and a meaningful amount went to an organization that works on physician wellness and mental health. Because I have watched my daughter run herself to the edge of empty for 12 years, and I want someone fighting for the people who fight for the rest of us." I turned to Nathan's parents, who had the slightly ashen look of people reassessing a situation in real time. "George, Vivian, I appreciate your family's offer of support. Audrey won't be needing it. She never did. I just didn't want her to know that until she built enough of herself to know it too." I sat down. The table was silent for about 4 full seconds, which is a very long time at a dinner with 40 people. Dr. Osei started clapping, slowly at first, then not. Audrey crossed the distance from her seat to mine in about 3 steps, which given the table layout was not physically efficient but emotionally precise, and she put her arms around me and didn't say anything for a while. Nathan sat very still. His father said to no one in particular, "Well, I'd recorded the dinner. Not secretly. I'd told the restaurant in advance that I wanted to capture the evening, and there was a small camera placed with the restaurant coordinator's knowledge. In California, I'd checked. You can record in a restaurant with the establishment's consent. I had it. I didn't release it. That's the part people sometimes find surprising. I had it, and I chose to keep it private. Because Audrey asked me to, and because the people who mattered in that room had already seen everything they needed to see. I didn't need the internet. I needed my daughter to know who she was. Nathan and Audrey's relationship ended 11 days after graduation. She called me on a Sunday, her regular time, and told me. Her voice was steady, tired but steady. She said she'd been seeing things clearly for a while and that the dinner had just made it impossible to unsee. I kept making excuses, she said, telling myself he was under pressure, or that he'd get better, or that I was being too sensitive. You weren't too sensitive, I said. I know, she said. I know that now. She asked me about the trust. She cried again when I explained it. She asked why I hadn't told her about the money years earlier. Because you would have used it as a reason not to push yourself, I said. And watching you push yourself has been the greatest thing I've ever seen. There was a long quiet on the phone. Mum would have liked tonight, she said finally. She would have stood up first, I said. That made her laugh. And if you knew Carol, you'd know it was also just accurate. 4 months later, Audrey started her residency at UCSF. She moved into a clean apartment in the inner Sunset neighborhood, bought some decent furniture, joined a book club with 2 other first-year residents. She called me one Sunday in October and spent 40 minutes telling me about a case she'd worked on, the kind of excited rambling I'd missed for over a year. I drove my F-150 out to visit her in November. 11 hours, 2 stops, 1 terrible gas station sandwich. She met me outside her building, and we went to a dim-sum place in the Richmond district that she'd found on her own. And we sat there for 3 hours, and she ordered in confident, half-remembered Cantonese that she'd been practicing from an app. And the owner thought that was wonderful, and so did I. Nathan Caldwell, I heard through Gil, had left the wealth management firm. There were some differences of opinion with his uncle. He was reportedly exploring opportunities in real estate. I showed nothing about that except mild confirmation. What I felt instead was this. Sitting across from my daughter in that restaurant, watching her explain to me the difference between 2 kinds of dumplings, with the same precision she'd use on a case presentation, I thought about the room in Dayton with the washer-dryer. And the 5 a.m. coffee on the kitchen table, and Carol in the last year of her life telling Audrey, "You are exactly what I hoped you'd be." And I thought that $41 million is a lot of zeros, but it is not the most valuable thing I had ever accumulated. The most valuable thing was sitting across from me, stealing the last pork dumpling while explaining why she technically deserved it. I let her have it. I'd been letting her have things her whole life. The difference now was that she knew exactly what she'd earned and what she hadn't. And she was starting to learn, the way all of us have to eventually, which parts of yourself are built from love, and which parts are built from pressure, and which parts, the best parts, are built from both. At once, she walked me to my truck when we were done. It was cold for San Francisco, which means it was about 55 degrees, and everyone was in a puffy coat. She hugged me in the parking lot for longer than she had since she was small. "You could have told me sooner," she said into my shoulder, "about all of it." "I know," I said. "I wanted to give you the chance to be exactly who you are without it." She pulled back and looked at me. Carol's eyes. Always Carol's eyes. "I think I'm starting to figure out who that is," she said. "I know," I said. "I've known for years." I drove back to Dayton. 11 hours. Good sandwich this time, at a place in Sacramento she'd looked up for me. I was home by midnight. The next Sunday, the phone rang at exactly the usual time. I picked up before the second ring. I've been thinking about what Nathan actually cost himself that night. Not the inheritance. He never had a claim on that. Not the relationship. That was already built on sand before I ever walked into Acquarello. What he cost himself was something harder to name, the chance to be someone worth becoming. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I've watched it happen to people my whole life, and it never stops being a waste. You spend so long performing wealth, performing status, performing the version of yourself you think the room needs to see, that you forget to actually build anything. Nathan had a grandfather who built something real. Somewhere between that generation and his, the building stopped and the performing started. And performing is exhausting work with nothing to show for it at the end. What I know from 63 years in a washer-dryer room in Dayton is that character doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up, quietly, in how you treat the person at the end of the table. In whether you turn to look when your partner cries happy tears, or whether you're already across the room networking. These aren't small things, they're the whole thing. Audrey spent 12 years becoming a physician. She didn't do that because it was comfortable or because someone made it easy for her. She did it because she had something inside her that needed to grow toward something hard. I watched her study at my kitchen table until 2 a.m. I watched her fail her first biochemistry exam and not quit. I watched her lose her mother and grieve, and then go back to school because Carol would have wanted her to, and because she wanted to herself. Nobody gave her that. She built it. 1 year, 1 semester, 1 terrible exam at a time. That's what I wanted to protect when I kept the money quiet, not the money itself. Money is just numbers. What I wanted to protect was her chance to know without any doubt that she had done it herself. That when she walked across that stage, it was entirely hers. Because when life gets hard later, and it does, that knowledge is what you reach for, not the trust fund. The memory of who you proved you were when it was hard. The consequence of how Nathan treated people wasn't something I arranged. I didn't set out to ruin anything. I stood up at that table because cruelty in a room full of people aimed at someone sitting alone at the end doesn't deserve silence. That's not revenge. That's just refusing to be part of the performance. What happened to him after was just the natural weight of how he'd been moving through the world finally catching up. That's not punishment. It's just physics. Audrey calls every Sunday. Same time, same voice. Except more settled now, more sure of itself. Last week, she spent 20 minutes telling me about a 12-year-old patient who reminded her why she chose this. She wasn't performing anything. She was just talking to her dad. That's the whole inheritance right there.